Thank you for joining me. I'm Robin Puglia. I'm the VP of Education for Cyrex Labs for the UK, Europe, and Ireland. And in this video, I'm going to provide an overview of all of the tests that Cyrex Labs offer. This is not an in-depth profile of any of the individual arrays. I would like to invite you to download the clinical application guides from the Cyrex website, or to book in for a technical support call with me if you would like to do a deep dive into any one of the individual tests or to have more training on the Cyrex tests in general. But if you are new to Cyrex and you haven't used any of their panels before and you've been wondering which tests we offer and which profile looks at what marker, then this information will help you. It is generally considered that to develop an autoimmune disease, you need to have three variables in place. So the first of those is genetic predisposition. Then we also need to have some kind of barrier permeability, very often gut permeability, with the resulting immune system dysregulation from that, and an environmental trigger or even multiple environmental triggers to develop autoimmunity in the first place. So Cyrex is a functional immunology lab that is investigating environmentally induced autoimmunity. So we have a strong focus on the environmental triggers and the immune system dysregulation and barrier permeability. So I'd like to introduce you to the Cyrex system. So the Cyrex system is comprised of three integrated categories for assessing both established or diagnosed autoimmunity and also developing autoimmunity in the early stages before it's at the diagnosable level. We look at antibodies to tissue, which is a hallmark of autoimmunity. So the loss of immune tolerance to self-tissue is identified with antibodies to that tissue. Then we look at two of the essential barriers, because barrier permeability and the resultant immune system dysregulation and inflammatory cascade is fundamental for the development of autoimmunity. And lastly, we look really comprehensively at three of the four categories of immune triggers: foods, toxins, and infections. So the fourth trigger is stress and trauma, but you can't measure antibodies to that particular category. So within the umbrella of the three categories of test, we also have a couple of panels that span all three categories of marker in one panel, such as our mucosal immune panel, which is array 14, and our cognitive assessment panel, also called Alzheimer's links. So in the barrier permeability category, we have array 2, which looks at the gut, and we have array 20, which looks at blood-brain barrier permeability. So this is array 2, and it includes three analytes for investigating transcellular permeability, paracellular permeability via the tight junctions, and it also assesses endotoxin or LPS, which is one of the critical features that helps us to better understand the actual immune consequences of the permeability. So this is a really groundbreaking panel. It's completely different to all of the other intestinal permeability panels on the market. And I'm always very excited when I see the results of this panel really changing the interventions that we put together in clinical practice and helping us to really understand the involvement of the gut in the inflammatory immune symptoms and functions that we see outside of the gut in the body. Array 20 is the blood-brain barrier permeability assessment. And this is a really important panel to run when there's any kind of fatigue, any mood dysfunction or brain fog, any brain endurance issues, or for changes in cognitive function or any kind of neurological autoimmunity. It's also really useful for helping to assess people who play contact sports or that have had any kind of head trauma. And also to be used alongside array 2, because the combination of elevated lipopolysaccharide antibodies in the systemic circulation and blood-brain barrier permeability has a really significant clinical implication for inflammation of the brain and long-lasting gut-brain axis issues. So these panels work very, very well together. Next, we look at immune triggers, and we have multiple panels that span the three categories of immune triggers that we're looking at: foods, infections, and toxins. So understanding what is triggering autoimmunity and inflammatory responses is obviously really critical for creating targeted and effective treatment plans. Every person with an autoimmune disease will have a unique set of triggers that won't necessarily be obvious at the onset of the case. So starting with food reactions, Cyrex actually has 3 panels that assess food immune reactivity. So we have Array 3, which looks at wheat and gluten. We have Array 4, which looks comprehensively at dairy proteins and also includes foods that are found on the gluten-free diets and have the ability to cross-react with gluten. And lastly, we have a really groundbreaking panel, Array 10, which looks at 180 foods. So Array 10 has been really fundamental in changing the way we understand and assess food in the context of autoimmune disease specifically. It's pretty revolutionary, and I'll explain a little bit more about why it's so different. And from a personal perspective, it's actually the #1 test that I use in my own clinical practice. And while food might be our primary tool in clinical practice, for people experiencing autoimmunity, we also need to consider the role of environmental chemicals, mold, and infectious agents in not only the development of the original autoimmune response, but also as a continued driver of inflammation and immune system dysregulation in someone with an established autoimmune disease. So these panels are especially helpful if someone is stalled in their progress using diet alone, or if their autoimmunity is considered unexplained, or when somebody has got multiple autoimmune diagnoses. So Array 3X is our gluten and wheat immune reactivity panel, and it's possibly our best known panel, as it was the first one on the market and to this day is the most accurate, comprehensive assessment of wheat and gluten immune reactivity. It includes the conventional markers for celiac disease, although it's not a diagnostic test, but it also includes markers that are specific to 2 other gluten-reactive autoimmune diseases, dermatitis herpetiformis and gluten ataxia, plus multiple proteins from wheat and gluten that help us to really understand non-celiac immune-mediated gluten sensitivity. So then we have Array 4. So Array 4 is a really comprehensive look at dairy protein immune responses, and it's a really brilliant clinical tool for understanding dairy reactivity. But it was originally designed to answer the question, why do I still have symptoms even though I'm on the gluten-free diet? So this panel also looks at markers for foods that are the top allergens, corn, egg, and soy. It looks at foods that cross-react with gliadin. It looks at the ingredients to gluten-free processed foods such as tapioca and amaranth, or foods that are commonly consumed on the gluten-free diet such as rice, quinoa, and potato. This panel is a standalone panel, so it can be used on anyone irrespective of their gluten reactivity status, and you do not have to be eating gluten to run this panel. So Array 10 is an innovative panel that is really different to all of the other food sensitivity panels on the market. Array 10 assesses 180 foods plus gums and food colorings. And this is really helpful to understand the components of purchased and processed foods and also nutritional supplements that might be contributing to food immune reactions. Array 10 looks at IgA reactions in tandem with IgG reactions, which is really relevant to systemic responses in those with autoimmune or autoinflammatory illness. But one of the most important things to understand about Array 10 is that Cyrex has looked in detail at how the immune system responds to foods specific to how we actually eat the food. What do I mean by that? So you may or may not know that the standard for food reactivity panels worldwide is to use raw foods. So this might be in whole food form, or it might be in purchased powdered antigen form. But actually, there are many, many foods that we don't ever eat raw. We don't eat raw pork, we don't eat raw chicken, we don't eat raw quinoa or raw amaranth. And when you cook a food, it changes the way the protein folds, and changes in the protein structure changes the way it looks to the immune system and the antibody response, or its antigenicity. So in this panel, Cyrex actually tests foods in the form that they are eaten or processed. And if that's in multiple forms, then Cyrex tests multiple forms. So chicken is only test cooked because we don't eat raw chicken, but salmon is tested both raw and cooked because we eat raw salmon in sushi and sashimi, and we also eat cooked salmon. Grapes are tested as grapes, but they're also tested fermented as wine. Potatoes are tested baked and fried, but not raw because we don't eat them raw, and so on. And when you run the test a few times, you will really see that the immune system definitely does flag foods that are cooked differently to how it flags foods that are raw. And it becomes really difficult to use a different test knowing that it only uses raw antigens once you've seen that for yourself, having seen a few results. So each of the foods on RA10 is really extensively researched, and this test took years to develop, but it was really important to Cyrex to limit false positives and false negatives as best as possible so that their clinicians could really trust the results that they were getting, but also so that the results could be useful for getting real tangible clinical results for the patients that we're all trying to serve. So moving on from food, RA11 is also really different from the other chemical assessments that are available on the market because we are specifically looking at how chemical immune reactivity is connected to immune system dysregulation and autoimmune disease. So this test looks at chemicals that are common in the home and in the environment, right? These are the chemicals that are found in our everyday food, in our clothing, in our bedding, in our furniture, in our air, in our water. This test isn't, though, assessing body burden of the chemicals. It's measuring antibodies to those chemicals that are bound to the albumin of the patients. So we can see that the chemical isn't being cleared in a healthy way. It's actually attaching to the tissue of the person, and it's creating a new antigen from the tissue plus the specific chemical. The immune system is not tolerating this new antigen, and it's making antibodies to it, which will then be driving the inflammatory cascade and potentially directly the autoimmune destruction of that tissue. So running the panel in someone with an autoimmune disease can be really instrumental in understanding how to assess and address their home and their work environments, their personal care products and cleaning products in order to reduce their personal immune burden in a really targeted, really specific way, because this task can be very overwhelming due to the sheer number of chemicals in our home and our environment. So RA12 is the pathogen screen, and it contains a really wide range of bacteria, yeast, mold, viruses, and other microbes that are directly implicated in either initiating or perpetuating autoimmune disease and autoimmune responses. So this helps us cast a relatively wide net in someone that has a strong infection history or for whom the obvious interventions are not making the progress that we need. So this test really helps us to understand the health or the dysfunction of the individual's immune relationship with their microecology. Because again, like the chemicals, we are supposed to have a broad range of relationships with and exposures to infectious agents in the environment. And a healthy immune system will have a healthy bidirectional relationship with the things that it's coming into contact with. It will be able to live in harmony with those infections. And what we see in people that have got immune system dysregulation is that harmony, that symbiosis is broken. And we can assess the immune relationship with the infectious agents using RA12. And also the patterns that emerge from the results of RA12 can really help to determine specific either antimicrobial or immune supporting interventions, or it helps us to really narrow the focus of further investigative testing and provide very specific direction to a case where things might not be obviously clear. So next up, we have our predictive antibody screen. So this is the only panel that I know of that measures a broad range of the most common tissue-specific antibodies. This panel was assembled after it became known and understood that antibodies are present for years or even decades before an autoimmune disease reaches the diagnosable stage. So identifying antibodies when autoimmunity is at stage 1 with antibodies but no symptoms, or stage 2 where there are antibodies and symptoms but the disease is not yet diagnosable, this creates a really important clinical window for intervention, because we can aim to really significantly slow or even halt and reverse the progress and achieve results that are definitely more difficult when the tissue destruction has reached diagnosable stage. So RA5 assesses for common autoantibodies that are associated with gastrointestinal, endocrine and reproductive, cardiovascular, connective tissue, and neurological autoimmunity. It's really helpful for anybody with a diagnosed autoimmune disease, as they are at much higher risk for developing additional autoimmunity, and also for people that have identified intestinal permeability, to see if the immune consequence of intestinal permeability is leading down the pathway of autoimmune disease for somebody who has a strong susceptibility. So we also have RA7X, which is a subset of the markers found on RA5 that are specific to neurological tissue. But this is an expanded panel that includes IgM antibodies, making it helpful for assessing recent onset neurological autoimmunity. This is helpful after a head injury or trauma, such as those that happen from sports or injuries or accidents. It is also helpful for assessing idiopathic neurological conditions to see if there is an autoimmune component to it. So Cyrex currently has 2 panels for assessing more specific conditions. We've got RA22 for IBS and SIBO, and we have our cognitive assessment screen, or the LINCS panel. So RA22 measures markers that are associated with post-infectious IBS or SIBO, and also autoantibodies to the adherens junctions in the gut wall, which is just after the tight junction. This helps us to really understand that this person's IBS or this person's SIBO needs to be treated as autoimmune, which will require different interventions than a straightforward fermentation type SIBO result. And then the cognitive assessment panel, or Alzheimer's associated immune reactivity panel, looks in detail at the immunology of cognitive decline and Alzheimer's disease. So this panel measures antibodies to specific neurological tissues and proteins, plus the foods, toxins, and infections that cross-react with those proteins and tissues, the neurological proteins and tissues. So this represents a really unique way of assessing and understanding immune reactivity to a particular tissue. And I really hope that the future brings us a panel like this for all of the 80 autoimmune diseases, such as one for rheumatoid arthritis, one for thyroid autoimmunity, and more. I really think that this is very much where the future of autoimmune investigation should be headed. Okay, then we have mucosal immune assessment. So the mucosal immune system is home to 70% of the immune system and acts as a primary host defense against the physical environment and the factors found in that. So food, airborne molecules, viruses, the commensal antigens that are found on the gut wall, and plays a really significant role in barrier functions. So mucosal immunity is the main functional defense mechanism in urinary, respiratory, and gastrointestinal systems. And the intestinal mucosa specifically is an interface between the environment and the immune system, dealing with, on a regular basis, the interactions between the microbiome, the biofilms, the mucin layer of the gut, the associated protective compounds that are produced by the ecosystem found there, defensins, enzymes, secretory IgA, and more. So it has become really, really clear that the state of the microbial community and also the underlying immune cells, that ecosystem, that communication between those two subsets, contribute to the health or to the illness of the host. And we also really know more about the role of secretory immunoglobulins IgA and IgM, which are really important components of the first line of defense on all of the mucosal sites. So our mucosal immune assessment uses both secretory IgA and secretory IgM to measure responses. So similar to the cognitive assessments, Array14 actually measures a variety of markers that span the entire Cyrex system: autoantibodies, infections, chemicals, and toxins, so that we can assess the first line and early immune responses of the mucosal immune system. Unlike all of the other Cyrex arrays that I'm talking to you about today, this is a saliva panel, which also makes it very convenient for children and the elderly, for people who don't have access to phlebotomy services, or those who struggle to leave the house. And lastly, we have the total immunoglobulin panel, or the GAM panel. So people who have autoimmune or autoinflammatory conditions may have elevated or suppressed immunoglobulin levels as a result of their illness, and this can affect antibody test results, Cyrex, or any other antibody test result. Immunosuppressant medications, which are often prescribed for people with autoimmune and inflammatory conditions, can also affect immunoglobulin levels and also test results. So the GAM panel is available to run either ahead of time to assess suitability of the person for running a Cyrex or other antibody panel, or it can be run alongside a serum panel or added after any of the serum arrays as well. And this helps us really understand the context of the results that we're looking at. So that brings me to the end of the whirlwind tour of our test suite. And I hope that has really helped you understand what tests are available and when you might choose them for your clients or your patients. And I also hope to see you in my diary for a one-to-one support call very soon. Thank you so much for your attention today.